Hello, this is Greg Feely, and I'm going to be speaking for about the next half hour on terrorism in Indonesia and the study of terrorism. So, this is the first time I've made one of these recordings. I do so in a reasonably clear manner. There are really three main parts to my talk. The first is a discussion of terrorism and subjectivity. The second is looking at the problematic nature of terrorism studies itself. And last of all, I want to have a very quick examination of the dynamics of Indonesian terrorism. And one of the things I hope to achieve in this talk is to sensitize you to some of the problems that researchers into terrorism studies face. And one way in which I want to do this is to begin with a series of questions. So let me proceed to the question. Do you feel that you have a clear idea about who the terrorists are? As soon as the word terrorist is mentioned, do the images of certain faces appear in your mind or certain acts? The second question, are terrorists always bad? Whenever the term terrorist is used, do you always assume that you're talking about people who are engaged in utterly reprehensible acts? And the third question is, can terrorism ever be justified? Now, I raise these questions because there is a great deal of debate among scholars of terrorism, particularly those people who have a strong scholarly or disciplinary background, about what they see are some of the inherent problems. And one of the things they say is that not just members of the public, but also scholars often think that they know what terrorism is, and indeed, therefore, who the terrorists are. But in fact, when we try to agree upon a definition or to apply a definition of terrorism in a scholarly or a legal way, we come up against a great many problems and indeed a great many disagreements. If we look at the general media coverage of terrorism, it's very simple, and it revolves around these binary opposites of them and us, the terrorists being, of course, them, of good and bad, radical and moderate, and so on. Indeed, politicians will often describe terrorism in this way. If we look at the number of definitions of terrorism, we find there are a great many. One particular scholar has written a book in which I think he's catalogued around about 120 different definitions of terrorism. Certainly major definitions of terrorism probably exceed many dozens. There are in fact some scholars who assert that terrorism cannot be defined objectively because it is inherently a subjective category. Despite this, the majority of scholars who work on terrorism would agree to some general features that they would regard as present in the groups that they define as terrorist. And these general features would include the use of lethal violence or force, particularly aimed at non-combatants, at civilians, and usually for a political or religious purpose. Now, there are still a great many aspects of this simple definition that would be queried by quite a few reputable scholars of this field, but nonetheless, for our intents and purposes, it's probably sufficient for us to proceed on the basis that that is what's often regarded as terrorism. So coming back to these questions, do we know who the terrorists are? The slide in front of you is the front cover of a book by the Bali bomber, Imam Samudra, or Abdulaziz is his birth name. And the title says, "I fight terrorists," or "I oppose terrorists." And he is, of course, a convicted terrorist, and indeed he was executed about 5 years ago for his involvement as one of the key figures in the 2002 Bali bombing that killed 202 people. And he wrote this book in prison, or it's based on writings in prison, that justified his actions. And so in his title, when he says, "I fight terrorists," he's not referring to his own group, which was Jemaah Islamiyah. He's referring to Western nations and to Israel, in particular to George Bush, Tony Blair, John Howard, and the like. He refers specifically to these leaders in his book as the people who are undertaking acts of terrorism against the Muslim community. So here is a very good case of someone who sees terrorism in an entirely different light. The great majority of people in the West, indeed many people in the Muslim world, would see Imam Samudra as a terrorist, as someone engaged in evil acts. He, however, sees his actions as honourable, and the people who he is fighting in Western so-called infidel nations are the people who are bad. I raise these examples because I hope to get you thinking about some of these problems of perspective. And unfortunately, the great majority of literature on Southeast Asian terrorism is unreflective and shot through with assumptions that are never even explored by their authors. We often have these chains of moral equivalences, the sorts of things I referred to before, terrorist versus non-terrorist, good versus bad, and so on, as if these are clear-cut and simple categories. And in many of these texts, particularly texts written immediately after the 9/11 attack or the Bali bombing of 2002, we find very flat, mono-dimensional presentations of terrorism. We don't get any sense of the kind of nuance or struggles that may have taken place within terrorist groups, or indeed within the minds of individual terrorists about the actions that they have undertaken. And the problem for me is that a great deal of this literature fails in what would be one of the most basic objectives of scholarship, and that is to bring to us understanding, to deepen our knowledge, our comprehension of a particular set of phenomenon in the world. And in particular, a great many authors of scholarly texts on terrorism fail to take us inside the minds of the terrorists so that we can get some awareness of what it is that makes them do what they do. Aside from any moral judgments we might make about them, we must first begin with the task of understanding terrorism on its own terms. So one of the big challenges for terrorism scholars is that of imagination, informed by their research, to see and feel the world as terrorists experience it. If we don't have this, our ability to provide insight into terrorist activities is going to be a forlorn one. Among the problems that terrorism scholars of Southeast Asia face is that information is almost always deficient. A lot of the material we have is contradictory or scrappy. We hardly ever get a complete picture of events within a terrorist organisation such as Jemaah Islamiyah, or even what the dynamics were within a particular cell, including the cell of about 24 people who undertook the Bali bombing in 2002. The dynamics within that cell were very complicated, we know that much, but it's very hard to establish with any certainty what the details of those dynamics were. Sometimes this contradictory evidence, this fragmentary evidence, is part of a deliberate campaign by the terrorists themselves to deceive researchers, to deceive the police, to lessen the sense of their own guilt. And overall, one would have to say that this is a field where scholars should have very little certitude, that they can be that they need to be wary of what are the actual facts, what are the indisputable pieces of information that they may possess. Because repeatedly, scholars who wrote something in one year find out the next year that new information has cast doubt on what they'd previously written or proven it to be completely false. So this is a field of studies where humility should be a much prized quality. Another problem we find with terrorism studies is that it's not a discipline. It's not like political science or international relations or psychology. In fact, very often it's a kind of a mishmash of disciplines. And terrorism scholars will take parts of a certain discipline, let's say political science or psychology or sociology, and apply it to their study of terrorism. But in doing so, it's not always certain that they will have kept the rigour that was originally to be found in that discipline. And so there's a pick and choose element, and sometimes that can lead to very flawed application of various disciplinary perspectives. And many of these scholars of terrorism end up falling back on their own disciplinary training, whatever that might be. To my mind, some of the most successful terrorism research is that which has been multidisciplinary, which has had teams of people, smallish teams of people, who have expertise spread across a range of disciplines, and they can bring these skills together and try and form a more cohesive picture in trying to explain terrorism.